The girl is maybe 6 years old, and she is sitting in a small room inside an orphanage in Davenport, Iowa, across a wooden table from a young woman holding a notepad. The woman is gentle. She smiles, she leans in a little, and she tells the girl something serious in a calm and certain voice. She says there is a problem with the way the girl speaks. She says the girl is starting to stutter, that the early signs are already showing, and that from now on she has to be careful and catch every word before it trips her. The girl had not noticed anything wrong. An hour earlier she had been talking the way she always talked, quick and easy and unbothered. But the woman is an adult, and the adult sounds sure of herself, so the girl begins to believe her. She begins to listen to her own mouth. She begins to dread the next sentence before it even arrives. What the girl does not know, what almost no one in that building knows, is that there is nothing wrong with her speech at all. The kind woman with the notepad is running an experiment, and the girl is inside it. This is the story that the people who worked near it came to call the monster study. In 1939, at the University of Iowa, 22 children were folded into a test of one single idea, that you could reach into an ordinary child and bend the way they spoke using nothing but words. No drugs, no machines. Just an adult repeating the same verdict week after week, and a notepad recording what it did to them. The man who designed it genuinely wanted to understand stuttering, and he thought he was chasing something hopeful. What he built instead was a question that still does not have a comfortable answer. What does a false label from a trusted grown-up actually do to a child? And why did the people who wrote down that answer decide, for most of the next 60 years, that almost no one should ever be allowed to read it? The man who designed this experiment knew exactly what it felt like to be the child in that room, because he had once been that child. Wendell Johnson grew up on a farm in Kansas, unable to get his own words out. He stuttered severely from the time he was small, and in the early 1900s, that was treated as a defect to be corrected rather than a difference to be understood. He was handed to specialists who bound his right arm for months, working from a fashionable theory that his stutter came from a brain confused about which hand it preferred. They forced him to change the hand he wrote with. They ran him through exercises built on the belief that something deep in his nervous system was broken and needed to be rewired. None of it freed his speech. He carried the block in his throat all the way through boyhood and into college, where he still could not order a meal or answer a question in class without a fight. And then he did something unusual with all of that pain. He turned the thing that had shamed him into his life's work. Johnson came to the University of Iowa, which ran one of the only serious speech clinics in the entire country, and he decided he would find where stuttering actually begins, because in a lifetime of being poked and strapped and drilled, no one had ever been able to tell him. None of this reads like the work of a cartoon villain. Johnson was a wounded man chasing the origin of his own wound, and that is exactly what makes what he set in motion so difficult to file away as simple cruelty. For years at Iowa, Johnson watched hundreds of people who stuttered come through the clinic, and he kept noticing the same thing. Almost none of them could point to a first moment, a fall or an illness or a fright, that had started it. The stutter had crept in early, in the ordinary years when a child is first stringing sentences together, and it had grown from there in the dark. He became convinced that the answer was hiding in those earliest years, in the gap between how a child actually spoke and how the adults around that child chose to hear it. It was an elegant idea, and it fit his own life like a key, because Johnson had always suspected that the specialists and the strapping and the shame had not cured his stutter so much as carved it deeper. And a man who believes that adults made his own affliction worse has a powerful reason to prove it, even if proving it means walking into a room full of children who trust him. What Johnson arrived at was a theory that turned the whole problem inside out. He noticed that a great many young children stumble over words when they are first learning to talk. They repeat syllables, they hesitate, they trip on sounds, and most of the time it passes on its own, and no one thinks a thing about it. But sometimes an anxious parent hears those ordinary stumbles and panics. The parent starts correcting the child, telling him to slow down, to start over, to stop stuttering. Johnson came to believe that it was that reaction, the worried labeling, the constant nervous attention, that could take a normal childhood stumble and slowly harden it into a real and lasting stutter. He called it the diagnosogenic theory, a heavy clinical word for a simple and unsettling claim. Stuttering, he argued, does not begin in the child's mouth. It begins in the listener's ear. In a strange way, it is a hopeful idea. If stuttering is learned rather than born, then it can be prevented, and no child has to grow up believing he is defective the way Johnson had. But folded inside that hopeful idea was a much darker one, and Johnson could not prove any of it without walking straight toward that darkness. If a careless label could turn a fluent child into a stutterer, then the way to demonstrate it was obvious and monstrous. You would have to take children who spoke perfectly well. You would have to give them the label on purpose, and then you would have to sit back and watch and record to see whether they came apart. Johnson was not going to run that test with his own hands. He handed it to a graduate student. Her name was Mary Tudor, and in 1939 she needed a subject for her master's thesis. Johnson gave her one. The plan was written in the careful language of science, but underneath the terminology, it was exactly what it sounds like. Tudor would gather a group of children, she would tell some of the healthy ones that they were becoming stutterers, and she would keep telling them, session after session, month after month, while she wrote down what happened. To run a test like that, you need children nobody is going to ask hard questions about. You need children with no parents standing behind them, ready to object. Tudor found exactly that population at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans home in Davenport, a large state institution full of children the outside world had already stopped watching closely. It is worth pausing on why an orphanage was the natural choice, because it says a lot about the era. At the time, there were no ethics boards reviewing experiments, no requirement to get anyone's informed consent, no rule that a subject even had to be told they were in a study. All of the protections we now take for granted, the entire framework built after the world saw what unchecked human experimentation could become, simply did not exist yet. A researcher with a theory and access to institutionalized children could do very nearly whatever the theory required, and children in a state home were the most accessible subjects imaginable. No mother was going to phone the university and demand to know what was being said to her daughter, because the whole point of these children, in the cold arithmetic of research, was that no one was coming to check. Johnson and Tudor were not inventing that logic either. In the first half of the 20th century, the people most often used as research subjects were exactly the people with the least power to refuse. Orphans, prisoners, patients in state hospitals, children in institutions. They were available, they were controllable, and they could not walk away. The formal protections that would later forbid this, the requirement of informed consent, the review boards that now sit between a researcher and a vulnerable subject, were still years in the future, and they would only be written after the world was forced to see how far this kind of thinking could travel. A graduate student walking into that orphanage with a clipboard and a plan to deceive the children was not breaking any rule that existed yet. That is part of what makes the study so unsettling. Nobody had to sneak. Tudor selected 22 of them, ranging in age from about 5 to 16, and she sorted them into 4 groups. 10 of the children already stuttered. She split those 10 in half. One group of 5 was told, warmly, that their speech was really just fine and that they should pay no attention to anyone who said otherwise. The other 5 were kept on the ordinary discouraging track of the day, treated as stutterers with a problem to be drilled out of them. That half of the study, the half performed on children who already stuttered, is not the part that would eventually horrify people. The part that horrified people was the other 12 children, because those 12 did not stutter at all. They were normal, fluent kids. Tudor split them in half too. 6 of them were simply praised and reassured about their speech, and the last 6 healthy children with nothing whatsoever wrong with the way they talked, were chosen to be told, slowly and patiently and repeatedly, that they were turning into stutterers. Those 6 are the center of this story, so it is worth being honest about who they actually were, because the word orphan does a lot of quiet lying here. Most of the children in that Davenport home were not orphans in the way the term suggests. Many of them had living parents, mothers and fathers wrecked by the Great Depression, people who could not feed their own kids, and had handed them to the state to survive. One of the girls, Mary Korlaski, had been dropped off at the home by her own mother and spent years turning over the same unanswerable question of why she had been left there. So when a pretty young woman from the university started meeting with her one-on-one, giving her focused, patient attention that no overworked staff member in that building had time to give, Korlaski did not experience it as an experiment at all. She thought the sessions were something special, a program meant to help her. She reportedly hoped, in the aching way a lonely child hopes, that Mary Tudor might even become her new mother. That is the trust the experiment was built on top of. That is the trust it spent. Now hold the two halves of that room side by side, because the contrast is the entire design. In one set of sessions, Tudor sat with the children she was reassuring and told them, again and again, how well they were doing and how nicely they spoke. In the other set of sessions, she sat across from the 6 healthy children and read them, in effect, a script of failure. She told each of them that they were having a great deal of trouble with their speech. She told them they were showing the symptoms of a child who is beginning to stutter. She told them they had to do everything in their power to stop it before it got worse. She told them to watch their own mouths constantly, and not to speak at all unless they could be certain the words would come out right. There was no genuine therapy anywhere in this. No exercise, no technique, no treatment, nothing that could actually help a child, because helping was never the purpose. The entire intervention was the verdict itself, delivered over and over by someone the child had every reason to trust completely. What makes it harder still is that the children in the negative group often looked forward to seeing her. Tudor was not a stern figure looming over them. She was warm and attentive, and for kids starved of individual attention in a crowded institution, time alone with her was something close to a treat. She met with them repeatedly across that year, returning to that same small room, and each time the message underneath the kindness was the same. Your speech is slipping. You are starting to stutter. Be careful. The cruelty was never loud. It was patient and quiet, and wrapped inside the exact kind of attention these particular children craved most, and that is the reason it reached so deep. There is very little a small child can do to defend against a kind adult who has decided, for reasons the child will never be told, to convince them that they are breaking. And the children believed her, which is the part that is genuinely hard to sit with. These were not adults who could weigh a stranger's opinion against their own sense of themselves. They were kids, and a warm authority figure was telling them, calmly and repeatedly, that their own mouths were betraying them. So they did the only thing the label left them to do. They started to monitor every single sentence before they spoke it. They began to hesitate, not because their speech had changed in any real way, but because they were now afraid of it. A few of them stopped raising their hands in class. A few stopped talking to the other children in the home. One by one, the confident, chatty kids in that group started to go quiet, folding inward around a fear that an adult had carefully placed inside them. Tudor wrote all of it down, and her notes are genuinely painful to read. She recorded that one little girl, only 5 years old, became so reluctant to speak that it grew difficult to pull any words out of her at all. She recorded a 9-year-old boy who had started refusing to talk and who sat through their sessions with a hand or an arm held up over his eyes for most of the time, as though he could physically hide from what was happening. She noted that the schoolwork of the negative group fell off across the board. One of those 6 children was Norma Jean Pugh. She was 6 years old, and by every account she had been a fluent, talkative little girl when the study began. Over the months of the experiment, she went from chatty to nearly silent. And she would spend the rest of her childhood being shuffled from foster family to foster family, handed back again and again, because the families decided she was slow, or strange, or a misfit. Not one of them ever knowing that a graduate student had spent 6 months in 1939 quietly teaching her to be afraid of her own voice. Not every child in that group came apart in the same way, and it matters to be accurate about this. Some of the 6 reacted sharply and visibly. Others showed smaller changes, a new shyness, a hesitation that had not been there before. Tudor recorded the whole range of it in her thesis, and her own written conclusions were careful, even cautious. She did not claim that she had turned healthy children into stutterers. What she described was subtler and, in its way, more troubling. She had taken normal, fluent children and made them self-conscious about a problem they did not actually have, and she had watched that self-consciousness begin to change how they behaved, how they did in school, and how willing they were to open their mouths at all. She had shown, at the very least, that you could make a child believe something false about their own body, simply by being an adult and saying it with enough conviction. Tudor was not blind to what was unfolding in front of her. By early 1940, she was clearly shaken by the state, some of the children were in, and she did something the cold design of the study never asked her to do. She went back. On her own, 3 separate times, she returned to the orphanage and tried to undo it, tried to convince the children that their speech was fine after all, that she had been wrong about them. But a belief that took months to press into a child does not simply lift because the same adult now says the opposite. It had taken root. Years later, Tudor reportedly asked a question that lands like a quiet accusation against the whole project. She wanted to know why Johnson had never sent a trained therapist to genuinely help those children recover, given how much harder it is to talk a child out of a fear than it is to talk them into one. She had been able to plant the fear in a single afternoon. Pulling it back out was another matter entirely, and she seems to have known it. Here is where the story turns, and where the popular version of it gets something crucial wrong. For decades, the monster study has been told as the experiment that made orphans stutter, as if Tudor had reached into a room full of healthy kids and manufactured a room full of stutterers. But in 2002, 2 speech scientists at the University of Illinois, Nicolene Ambrose and Ehud Yairi, went back to Tudor's original data and analyzed it the way it should have been analyzed in the first place. They had a panel of trained, blinded judges compare the children's speech from before the experiment to their speech afterward. And what they found is the detail that almost every dramatic retelling leaves out. Measured honestly, the children's stuttering did not meaningfully change. The experiment, judged purely as an attempt to manufacture a speech disorder, had failed. It did not turn a single fluent child into a stutterer. Now sit with that for a moment, because it does not make the study less disturbing. It makes it worse. The horror of the monster study was never that it succeeded at building a stutter out of a healthy child. The horror is that the stutter was never the real wound in the first place. Tudor did not damage these children's vocal machinery, because she could not, and the data confirms she did not. What she damaged was something no fluency chart on earth can measure. She changed what the children believed about themselves. She took a 6-year-old who had never once worried about talking and handed her a lifelong suspicion that her own mouth could not be trusted. The label did not need to produce a real, clinical stutter in order to do real, lasting harm. It only needed to be believed. And a trusted adult telling a child, gently and constantly, that something is wrong with them is one of the most reliable methods ever devised for making that child believe it. That is the true instrument sitting at the heart of this experiment, and it is why the study belongs in a category almost by itself. There was no needle here, no electrode, no pill that anyone could point to afterward and blame. The entire apparatus was a sentence, spoken by someone a child trusted, aimed on purpose, and repeated until it took hold. You cannot photograph that kind of injury. You cannot X-ray it or measure it or graph it. And decades later, when these people tried to describe what had been done to them, they were trying to describe a wound made entirely out of words, which happens to be exactly the kind of wound that a courtroom, a scientist, and a university are all least equipped to recognize. So what did Johnson do with the results of the thing he had set in motion? He did almost nothing at all. The study that would one day carry the name Monster was never published as a proper scientific paper. Tudor's thesis was typed up, filed away, and shelved, and there it sat. The reasons it vanished are worth separating carefully, because this is precisely the point where a story like this tempts you to invent a grand and dramatic conspiracy, when the truth is quieter and in some ways more damning. Part of it was simply that the experiment had not worked. It had failed to prove Johnson's theory, and a study that fails to support its own thesis is an awkward thing to attach your name to when you are busy building a reputation as the country's leading authority on stuttering. But there was clearly more to the silence than an inconvenient result, and here the record shifts from documented fact to what has been widely reported and reasonably inferred. The experiment had been run before the war. Within just a few years, the world learned in full what doctors and scientists in Nazi Germany had done to human beings in the name of research, and a permanent new standard of horror attached itself to the phrase human experimentation. It has been widely reported that Johnson and the people around him understood, in that harsh new light, exactly what their study on 22 orphan children would look like if it were ever laid out in public. A respected professor had ordered healthy children in a state institution labeled as defective, on purpose, to see what would happen to them. You did not have to squint very hard to catch the resemblance to the thing the entire world was now condemning. Whether or not anyone ever said it plainly in a formal decision, the study stayed buried, and it is not hard to understand why the people whose careers it threatened were content to leave it exactly where it was. The clearest evidence of how his own colleagues felt about it is the name itself. Johnson did not call it the monster study. His own graduate students and peers did, in the years that followed, and the grim nickname stuck precisely because of how the thing had been run, on children who were never told the truth, and staff who were kept in the dark about what was really being done. When the people inside your own field, the ones who know you and work beside you, quietly start calling your experiment a monster, that is a verdict. It simply was not a verdict anyone was willing to put into print. A speech scientist named Franklin Silverman finally did commit the name to paper in an academic journal in 1988. But even then, the story stayed locked inside the specialist world of speech pathology. The public still knew nothing, and while the study itself sat forgotten in a basement, the theory behind it did not sit still for 1 second. Johnson went on to become one of the most influential speech pathologists in America. He directed the university's speech clinic through the 1940s and 50s. He wrote widely read books, and his diagnosogenic theory hardened into accepted wisdom for an entire generation. For decades, parents of children who stuttered were told, in effect, that they had caused it. They were instructed not to name the stutter, not to react to it, not to draw the slightest attention to their child's speech, because attention was the poison. Mothers in particular were sent home carrying the crushing guilt of having supposedly broken their own children with a few worried words. The idea that grew out of Johnson's work reshaped how an entire country understood and treated stuttering, and it did all of that while the single experiment meant to prove it stayed hidden, unread, and privately renamed a monster by the very people best positioned to judge it. Researchers today understand stuttering very differently. The evidence now points strongly to genetics and to real differences in how the brain organizes speech, and the old idea that a nervous parent creates a stutterer has largely been set aside, along with the decades of misplaced blame it produced. There is one more uncomfortable wrinkle in all of this. However indefensible the way Tudor gathered it, the information she wrote down was, in scientific terms, unusually rich. A speech researcher at Iowa, named Patricia Zabrowski, would later point out that Tudor's raw records amounted to one of the largest single collections of data ever assembled on how disfluency actually behaves in children. The study that Johnson's own colleagues called a monster, the one that sat in a drawer for 60 years, had produced real knowledge, gathered in a way that no researcher today would ever be allowed to repeat. That is the quiet moral trap sitting underneath the entire case. The data was tainted at its source, and it was also genuinely useful, and there is no clean way to hold both of those facts in your hand at the same time. The children, meanwhile, simply grew up. They left the orphanage and carried whatever the experiment had put into them out into ordinary lives, with no name for it and no one to hold responsible, and they would have carried it silently to the grave if it were not for a single reporter. In 2001, 62 years after those sessions in Davenport, an investigative journalist named Jim Dyer, working for the San Jose Mercury News, went digging into Wendell Johnson's history and found the study that everyone in the field seemed to half know about, and no one had ever truly dragged into the open. He pulled the details out, he tracked down surviving participants, and he published a series of articles, and the thing that had stayed inside university hallways for 6 decades finally broke into daylight. The University of Iowa, confronted with its own history in black and white, issued a formal public apology that same year, calling the study regrettable and indefensible. By the time that apology came, the man at the center of it had been dead for more than 30 years. Johnson died in 1965, a celebrated figure, honored by his profession, his name eventually fixed to the very building at Iowa where speech and hearing research is carried out. He never faced a single public question about Davenport. Whatever reckoning finally arrived came far too late for him to answer for it, and far too late for most of the children, who were elderly or already gone. The apology, the lawsuit, the settlement, all of it came down on a later generation of administrators and taxpayers who had nothing to do with the original choice, while the people who had actually been in that room, the graduate student, the professor, and the 22 children, were nearly all beyond its reach. For the survivors, the reporting did something strange and genuinely important. It handed them an explanation. Imagine spending your entire life quietly believing that something was wrong with you, that you were slower or more anxious or more broken than the people around you, and then learning in old age that the feeling had been installed on purpose by an adult who was running a test and lying to your face. That is close to what several of them described. Norma Jean Pugh, who had gone by the married name Catherine Meacham for most of her life, said that learning the truth arrived like a revelation, a sudden answer to a question she had been carrying since she was 6 years old. Another participant, Mary Nixon, had grown into a woman who lived largely alone, described as a recluse in a retirement home, convinced across her whole adult life that she had a speech problem other people could hear. She did not, and she never had. She had been handed that belief in a small room in 1939 and had lived the rest of her years inside it. Group these people together, and the pattern is not a room full of stutterers, because that is not what the experiment ever produced. The pattern is a scattering of quiet, self-doubting adults who spent decades certain that some flaw inside them was real, when the flaw had only ever been a sentence read off a graduate student's page. That is the human ledger of the monster study. Not damaged voices, damaged self-belief, spread thin across a lifetime, sitting inside people who never once knew where it had come from, until a newspaper finally told them in their 70s. In 2003, 3 of the surviving participants, together with the estates of 3 others who had already died, sued the state of Iowa. The state did not want to pay, and it fought the case largely on the argument that too much time had passed, that the events were nearly 70 years old, and long out of the reach of any court. In 2005, the Iowa Supreme Court disagreed, ruling by a narrow 4-3 margin that the survivors could move forward, precisely because they had come to court promptly after finally learning, through the reporting, what had actually been done to them as children. You cannot start the clock on a wrong that was deliberately hidden from the people it was done to. In 2007, the case ended in a settlement. The state of Iowa paid a total of $925,000 to the 6 plaintiffs, split among the living survivors and the estates of the dead. They had originally sought $13.5 million, and the state, right to the very end, refused to admit that it had done anything wrong at all. Think for a second about what that settlement actually represents, because it is stranger than it first appears. A state government paid close to $1 million over an experiment that, by the best scientific reading of its own data, did not even succeed at what it set out to do. There was no measurable stutter anyone could point to, no clean physical injury, no chart that spiked on the day the harm was done. Iowa was not paying for a speech disorder. It was paying, however grudgingly and however silently, for the 60 years that a group of people had spent believing a lie about themselves, a lie that had been placed inside them when they were children, who had no way to defend against it. Whatever a court would or would not formally call that, it is a real thing, and everyone in that room knew it was real. So go back to the small room one last time, because that is where this whole story actually lives. A young girl at a wooden table, an adult leaning toward her with a notepad and a warm, certain voice. No restraints anywhere. No instruments, nothing you could ever hold up in a photograph as evidence of cruelty. Just an authority figure telling a child that something was wrong with the way she spoke, and then carefully writing down what that belief did to her over the following months, and, though no one in that room could have known it, over the following decades. The most disturbing tool in the entire monster study was never hidden inside a laboratory. It was the oldest tool there is. It was a grown-up that a child trusted, saying, with total confidence, that the child was broken and being believed. The stutter was never really the experiment. The belief was. If these are the kinds of stories you would rather understand than look away from, take a second to subscribe, and I will keep digging up the ones that got buried.